Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. It is a frequently asked question if the events of 1915 during the Ottoman Empire did not constitute an Armenian genocide, then what was it? Well, the short answer is that it was a military wartime measure taken to mitigate a wartime military threat to the Ottoman war effort. The threat was very serious. It was posed by a widespread network of Armenians, Ottoman Armenians, who were either directly involved in violent revolts, terrorism, and treason, or acted as logistic support base to such Armenian insurgents. Since it was impossible to separate guilty from the innocent at a chaotic time of world war, brutal Russian invasion, and many vicious Armenian revolts, the Armenians of entire villages and towns in the war theater of Eastern Anatolia had to be evacuated. Even then, most of the Armenians in the western part of the parts of the Ottoman Empire were exempt from this temporary relocation or TERESET order of May 27, 1915. Because they posed no threat to the Ottoman war effort, and some were indeed supportive of the Ottoman war effort. There were many exemptions from the TERESET order. Armenians in the employ of the Ottoman government, essential craftspeople, Catholics, and Protestants were all excluded from the TERESET order. The relocation was temporary. Those Armenians who had not been involved in any acts of violence and sedition could return to their homes after the war. That was the premise. This alone shows that TERESET was no genocide. I covered this in issues in episodes 19, 24, and 25. Such relocations are not uncommon in history. The U.S. resorted to forced relocation measure a whopping 27 years later during the Second World War by moving the Japanese Americans to concentration camps for no good reason. After all, Japanese Americans had committed no acts of hostility or sedition in the United States. They were still moved just because of a fear that they might join the Japanese enemy if the Japanese army invaded America. Imagine that. Anyway, I covered this in episode 37. On the one hand, the U.S. lectured Turkey for resorting to forced relocation of its violent and treasonous citizens in 1915. But on the other, the U.S. forces its own totally innocent citizens of Japanese heritage into concentration camps almost 3 decades later. So, on the one hand, the U.S. blames the Ottoman Empire with committing the crime of genocide for taking a totally justifiable wartime homeland security measure, while expecting to remain beyond reproach for an obviously unjustified, unethical, and brutal act of ethno-religious discrimination on the U.S. soil. I covered this also in episode 38. That said, both Armenians and Muslims in Eastern Anatolia experienced agonizing casualties and gripping damages during the World War I. While numbers are debatable, hundreds of thousands perished on both sides. Most were innocent. Most were caught up in a turmoil of wartime violence. All deserve sympathy and respect. Their known and unknown graves testify to the suffering endured by all, not just the Armenians. No race, religious, or ethnic group stands above or below another in the eyes of humanity. These sentiments must be remembered before entering into long-standing dispute over the allegations of Armenian genocide at the hands of Ottoman Turks during World War I and its aftermath. Genocide is a word loaded with passion and moral corruption. It typically evokes images of Jews dying in Nazi cyanide chambers in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and other extermination camps. It is customarily confined in national laws and international covenants to the mass killing or repression of racial, religious, or ethnic group with the intent of partial or total extermination. To accuse Turks of Armenian genocide is grave business and therefore should be appraised with meticulous care for historical accuracy. To do less would be unjust to the accused and erode the meaning of genocide. It must be stressed that to discredit the Armenian claims of genocide is not to deny that Armenian deaths or minimize Armenian suffering. It is simply to lift the shroud of ethno-religious bias, falsifications, and dishonesty from a narrative to remind us of the Armenian complicity in a sea of war crimes and hate crimes, along with the Muslim, mostly Turkish suffering they caused. This debate should not be turned into a contest of Armenians or Turks as a group were more or less responsible or victimized. A civilized dialogue on genocide allegations should not be transformed to venomous accusations by any side. Healing, reconciliation, peace, and closure in that order can only come from applying the concepts of fair memory and shared pain in an honest and courageous way. This is the only way to resolve this 100-year-old conflict. If we fail to engage in a reasoned debate based on facts, not fiction or falsification, then our grandchildren will be as polarized in another 100 years as Turks and Armenians are today. Discrediting the political claim of Armenian genocide is not diminishing the atrocities and the brutalities that World War I inflicted on all the peoples of Eastern Anatolia, Muslims and Armenians alike. War is hell, deplored the resolute Union General W.T. Sherman in an 1879 speech. Quote, "You don't know the horrible aspects of war. I've been through 2 wars and I know. I've seen cities and homes in ashes. I've seen thousands of men lying on the ground, their dead faces looking up at the skies. I tell you, war is hell." Unquote. Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, showed us the way with these immortal words of reconciliation. Quote, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which we may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace." Unquote. While believing in fairness, balance, and truth, I'm aware of the famous saying by the U.S. Senator Hiram Johnson in 1918, quote, "The first casualty when war comes is the truth." Unquote. It is typical among nations at war to manipulate the reporting of events to defame the enemy and to enhance the image of their own and allied forces. Britain during the World War I excelled at such manipulations, and I covered British propaganda in 4 episodes from episodes 20 through to 23. The Ottoman Turks are accused of planning and executing a scheme of extermination of its Armenian population in Eastern Anatolia beginning on April 24, 1915. Turks did this, it is claimed, by relocating the innocent Armenians hundreds of miles to the southwest regions of the Ottoman Empire, away from the Russian war front, and massacring those who resisted. This mass relocation, it is further added, exposed the Armenians to mass killings by marauding Kurds and other Muslims, and deaths from malnutrition, starvation, and disease. After the World War I concluded, the Ottoman Turks are said to have continued their Armenian genocide during the Turkish War of Independence, concluded in 1922. The number of alleged casualties began at more than 200,000 in the March 19, 1919 report by War Responsibilities Committee to the Paris Peace Conference. It soon was inflated to 600,000 in posters in the United States, then to 800,000 on the columns of New York Times, and then to 1 million, and then to 1.5 million and beyond. I have seen crazy numbers as high as 2 million, 2.5 million, even 3.5 million. Since dead do not multiply, critical thinking demands that we see the crude manipulation in these numbers. Yes, even one person dead is one person too many. I understand that. And we should not reduce the human suffering to numbers. I agree. But does that mean that we foolishly accept these obvious fallacies? Whereas the Ottoman numbers are firmly entrenched in truth. The last Ottoman census of 1914 puts the Armenian population numbers at 1.3 million. This number ought to be true because the Ottoman government collected taxes based on these numbers. Any argument that the Ottoman government manipulated this number is absurd, as it would assume that the Ottoman government knew that the Armenians would revolt everywhere and join the invading enemy armies, that the Ottoman government would have to temporarily resettle or TERESET Armenians in a year, and that Armenians would lose many souls during the TERESET, and finally, to diminish those casualty numbers ahead of time for propaganda purposes, the Ottoman government would have to reduce the Armenian population number in 2014 census, i.e. a year ahead of time. That's ridiculous. Here's the Armenian camp's argument for you. How absurd is that? Was there an intent to exterminate Ottoman Armenians in whole or in part? The evidence seems extremely thin. The government's relocation decree was a wartime military measure, motivated by self-survival of the homeland. Neither aimed at the Armenians generally, as many Armenians outside war zones were left untouched, nor the goal of death by circumstances of TERESET, such as hardships and hazards. The Ottoman government issued explicit orders to protect and feed Armenians during their temporary resettlement, or TERESET, but were unable to ensure their correct implementation because of war emergencies on many fronts and wartime shortages of food and medicine and other resources affecting the entire population. Here's what the decree provided. Quote, when those of Armenian residents in the aforementioned towns and villages who have to be moved are transferred to their places of settlement and are on the road, their comfort must be assured and their lives and property protected. After their arrival, their food should be paid for out of the Refugees Appropriations Fund, until they are definitively settled in their new homes. Property and land should be distributed to them in accordance with their previous financial situation as well as current needs. And for those among them needing further help, the government should build houses, provide cultivators and artisans with seed, tools, and equipment. This order is entirely intended against the extension of the reach of the Armenian revolutionary committees. Therefore, do not execute it in such a manner that might cause the mutual massacre of Muslims and Armenians." Unquote. The Ottoman government prosecuted about 1,600 soldiers and civilians for disobedience. Further, approximately 200,000 Ottoman Armenians who were relocated to Syria lived without menace throughout the remainder of the war. About 750,000 Armenians were moved by TERESET, and 500,000 were accounted for in Syria, according to the Near East relief reports. This is an area that includes today's Lebanon and Iraq. If you do the math, you will find that Armenian casualties number more than 200,000, which matches that which was revealed in the March 29, 1919 report by the Paris Peace Conference subcommittee. Another 400,000 Armenians went north to Armenia, who were met with a cycle of starvation and epidemics in Armenia, which caused the deaths of about 150,000 Armenians. About 100,000 went to Europe, North America, and elsewhere. The balance of about 100,000 remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire and were not moved. Turkish researcher and writer Kamuran Gürün puts the total number of Armenian casualties at 300,000, while historian and demographer Justin McCarthy calculates it to be at 600,000. The Turkish Historical Society in Ankara was able to track the police reports and documents and documented the deaths of 54,000 Armenians, of whom 8,000 were due to bullets, while the balance to food and medicine shortage, starvation, epidemics, and other elements. Forcibly relocating populations suspected of disloyalty, hostility, or treason was a customary war measure throughout history, including both the First and Second World Wars. Soviet Union had employed it in 1944 against 500,000 Crimean Tatars and other ethnic Turks. The United States employed it in 1942 against 120,000 American citizens of Japanese ancestry. Britain employed it in 1900 against 100,000 Boer citizens in Africa, South Africa. France, Germany, China, Brazil, Spain, and many other countries, they all employed it at one time or another. Yet, when Turks justifiably employed it during a wartime, ethno-religious bias kicks in, critical thinking is abandoned, and TERESET becomes a genocide. The TERESET, or mass wartime temporary resettlement of Ottoman Armenians from the Eastern Front, was no pretext for genocide. That conclusion is bolstered by mountains of evidence showing clearly that a frightening percentage of Armenians were treasonous, joining the enemy armies, invading enemy armies, Triple Entente armies, especially Russia's. Tens of thousands defected from the Ottoman army or evaded conscription altogether to serve with Russia. Countless more remained in Eastern Anatolia to conduct sabotage behind Ottoman lines and to massacre Turks, including civilians. Their leaders openly called for revolt and boasted at post-World War I peace conferences that Ottoman Armenians had fought shoulder to shoulder with the victorious powers. I covered the massive confessions of the Armenian leaders in episodes 54 through 61. Here, for example, is what an Armenian representative in the Ottoman parliament, nothing less, for the city of Van, Papazian, claimed, quote, "The volunteer Armenian regiments in the Caucasus should prepare themselves for battle, serve as advanced units for the Russian armies to help them capture the key positions in the districts where the Armenians live, and advance into Anatolia, joining the Armenian units already there." Unquote. Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, and others, acknowledged the enormous wartime service of Ottoman Armenians. Armenians were rewarded for their treason against the Ottoman Empire in the stillborn Treaty of Sevres of 1920, which was replaced by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. It created an independent Armenian state carved from Ottoman territory, although the Armenians constitute a tiny minority in that territory. Thus, it was the first apartheid attempted in the 20th century. Turning President Woodrow Wilson's self-determination principle on its head, the Ottoman government had devastating evidence to prove the disloyalty of most of its Armenian population. TERESET order responded to a disastrous war emergency, not a manufactured one. The Ottoman Empire was fighting on 3 major fronts and numerous minor ones. The capital, Istanbul itself, was threatened by the Gallipoli campaign. Russia was occupying portions of Eastern Anatolia, encouraging Armenian defections and aiding Armenian sabotage. The mass relocation of Armenians was clearly an imperative war measure. TERESET had nothing to do with any intention to exterminate Armenians, as fallaciously claimed by the Armenian lobbyists today. The genocide claim was debunked, ironically, by no one else than Great Britain's own failed attempts to prove Ottoman officials of war crimes. Great Britain occupied Istanbul and assigned an Armenian in charge of the Ottoman archives. This gave Great Britain full access to all Ottoman archives for more than 3 years. Yes, after 3 years of frantic research, the royal prosecutors found no evidence of Armenian genocide that could withstand the scrutiny of royal courts. Scores of Ottoman Turks were detained in Malta under suspicion of complicity in Armenian massacres. But all Turks had to be released in 1921 due to sheer lack of evidence. The British even solicited the assistance of the United States, but came up empty. Rumor, hearsay, slanders, forgeries, and diatribes from anti-Turkish sources were all that could be compiled. Imagine that. None of this would be admissible in any competent tribunal to discover facts or assign legal responsibility. This is not to deny that more than 200,000 Ottoman Armenians perished during World War I and its aftermath. Reciprocally, though, more Muslims, mostly Turkish, met their tragic ends at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries and Russians. The Turkish Historical Society tabulated the numbers of Muslim dead, totaling 518,000. When Armenians had the chance, they massacred Turks with refined cruelty. as the two American visitors to Eastern Anatolia in 1919, namely Niles and Sutherland, put it, in places like Van, Erzurum, Adana, and many others. I covered the Niles and Sutherland report in episodes 43 through 46. The war ignited a cycle of violence between both groups, one fighting for revolutionary objectives, the Armenians, and the other to defend their homeland against ruthless traitors and brutal foreign invasions, i.e. the Turks. The horrifying scale of the brutality and retaliations were acts of private individuals or official offenders. The Ottoman government constantly discouraged and severely punished such crimes within the realm of its gradually dwindling capacity. Fighting for its life on three major fronts, it devoted the lion's share of its resources and manpower to survival, not to local law enforcement. The hollowness of the Armenian genocide claim is further demonstrated by the Armenian use of hearsay, forgeries, and falsehoods. The alleged Talat Pasha telegrams, fabrications, are illustrative. Published in Paris in 1920 by an Armenian author, Aram Andonian. They were also introduced at the Berlin trial of the Armenian assassin of Talat Pasha, and they were later proven beyond a shadow of doubt that they were crude forgeries. I covered this in episode 3. There is more, much more, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week.